Ryan said, my name is Aaron, one of the pastors here at Grace. So glad you guys are here this morning as we continue in a series called Resolve. So we started this last week, and a couple of things to let you know about this series. If you did miss last week, make sure that you catch up on this. You can do that on our YouTube channel and find out what last week is about. A big reason for that is that this series is really kind of one big conversation. As I'm sure that you know, conflict is complicated. And so what we want to do is kind of walk you through one big conversation. I know that even since last week, you might have a conflict in mind, even another person in mind, and kind of that urge, like, man, I want to get at this. But we want to encourage you to kind of wait for that a little bit, get through this series, kind of hear the whole thing, and maybe then start to pray and think about how you could engage that in a helpful way. So be sure to catch up if you missed something and kind of engage this series as a whole. I've been really excited about this series for a while. Siri's talking to me, that's great. I love this idea because I don't know about you, conflict is a part of normal life. If you are a human being on this planet, you probably have some sort of conflict on a regular basis. You probably have maybe some larger conflicts in your life with relationships, and if you don't, you might be lying. So I think this is just so applicable to all of us, and it's going to be great. If you want to learn more about this kind of in a deeper way, there's a book that kind of goes along with this called Peacemaker. It is a large book. It has a lot of information in it, but if you really want to dive deeply into this, even deeper than we're going to, that's a great resource for you to do that. I want to give one disclaimer too before we jump in today as we talk about conflict and kind of walk through the series. I think it's important to say that when we talk about conflict, there's a couple of things that kind of are like asterisks to these conversations. One of those is that if you or what you're thinking of in this conflict series, if you're in a situation where there's abuse, there's dangerous situations, we need you to know that this is not what we're talking about. So if you look at conflict in your life and you're in one of those zones, we want you to know it's important to get the help that you need first, to find safety in those situations of maybe abuse or kind of dangerous situations before you even think about engaging that conflict. We want you to know that that's very, very important because the first step to resolving those types of conflicts is getting to a place of safety and finding the help that you might need and maybe engaging this later. So just want to give that as well before we start talking, especially today. So we jumped into this last week. We kind of have a theme verse here that we've been looking at. Paul says this. I've always been fascinated by this verse when I think about conflict. What Paul says in Romans is, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And so we kind of put this as a verse as we're looking at, man, when we engage conflict and the Bible talks about conflict, what are we actually doing here? And I've been fascinated by this verse. I've been challenged by it and the idea that as far as it depends on us, we want to live at peace with everyone. And it's, on one hand, it kind of makes you say to yourself, well, I know I have some work to do for this. And on the other hand, it's almost a little bit interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean that conflict is going to be resolved. It doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily get the outcome that I would hope for that would be good. But it does mean that as far as it depends on me, I'm going to be ready for that peace. And so to think about it that way is interesting. And when we look at this verse, this is where we want to start. Kind of presented the problem last week, and today I want to dive into what is the first step. If I think about conflict resolution in steps, what is the first step? And here's what I'm pretty convinced the first step is this. The starting point for resolving conflict is humbling ourselves. And I think this is pretty difficult because I don't know about you, when I walk into a conflict, I'm normally not thinking about how I'm wrong or how I might be wrong. I'm usually thinking, I am 100% correct. And this person needs to figure that out. The sooner for them, the better, right? That's usually the attitude, right? Maybe not that strong, but normally when I look at conflict, I'm thinking to myself, not usually that I'm wrong. I'm usually thinking I'm in the right here, all right? I think if we're honest with ourselves, most of the time, that is how we would walk in to conflict. And so when we think about this humility that we need to approach as the first step, I think this is so important because I think the degree to which we are able to humble ourselves, take maybe an honest, objective look at conflict, I think the degree to which we are willing to do that is 100% connected to the amount of resolution we might have in a conflict. So if last week or even today you're thinking about a situation, a person, a conflict that you're already in, the degree to which we're able to look at ourselves before we engage this is 100% going to be directly tied to the resolution you might have. That being said, right, so as much as I'm willing to do this, if I'm willing to do it a little bit, and I'll humble myself a little bit, fine, I'll probably have a little bit of success. If I'm willing to really give a hard look at myself and I'm like all in on this, I'm at least going to be positioned, as far as it depends on me, to have a large amount of success in this conflict. So I think this is so important to get our hearts in this spot. So I want to start to look at the Bible and how Jesus would talk about conflict. And one of the verses we often go to, and the chapters, is Matthew 18. You may have experienced this in church in a variety of ways, so I'm not like lumping them all into one. But when we look at this is where we often go to look at what does the Bible say about conflict? How do we resolve it, right? There's some steps in here. I actually want to go back to the beginning of this and look at Jesus and the disciples talking at the beginning. It doesn't seem totally connected, but I think that it is, as the Bible usually is. And when we look at this, I love it because the disciples have just kind of come out of an argument, right? They're probably youngish guys. And I don't know about you. I remember like in college and like late high school, one of my pastimes with my friends, maybe we were just weird, was like arguing. We really liked to like settle things. We're like, let's just debate about this and we'll like prove which snack is the best at that point in high school. It's like, or like Mountain Dew is definitely better than Mountain Drops from like Sam's Club, right? Like we would like, it's the same, or no, it's not. Like we would have these arguments. And so I think the disciples maybe are in the same spot, probably arguing about something better. But basically they come to Jesus at kind of the end of this. They're like, all right, we're going to go at Jesus. He's going to tell us what it really does. And I think they're expecting him to like back one of them up. He's like, you guys, Peter makes a great point here, so you guys are all wrong. And Peter's like, yes! I mean, if you have Jesus on your side, I mean, that's not much. But what Jesus does is maybe a little bit unexpected. So if we look here in Matthew 18, here's what it says. And at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And I don't know if they were arguing about types of people, if one of them was going to be the best. I don't really know. But they ask this. And so instead of Jesus saying a name or a person, he does something a little unexpected here. And I think this is important to think about today. It says, he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. This is really interesting to me when Jesus talks about a lowly position, right? They're coming out of this conflict, and Jesus does something a little unexpected. He basically asks them, he says, you have to change, and you have to be willing to take a place of humility, right? Not a child who's like oblivious or that way, right? When you're looking at me right now and you're thinking, Aaron, being childish in conflict is kind of the thing that we try to avoid, right? You're like, that actually is the problem. What Jesus is saying is not childish, but childlike. Right, if you think about in this time, right, in this lowly position, right, there's a child who's not like assuming that they're the greatest. It's a lowly position. They're not able to kind of advance their own cause, right? They just are, right? There's this humility around being a child. And Jesus is saying we have to change in this way. And what we start to realize about conflict, right, if we're going to approach conflict, we have to change maybe the way that we think about it, the way that we would approach it. And we would normally, I don't know about you, go to Jesus and say, Jesus, I'm right. Can you like help me here? And Jesus is saying the lowly position, right? Change the way that we think. And what we start to realize is that when we think about conflict, one of the things that is always present is pride. It's one of the biggest hurdles in conflict is ourselves, right? The fact that we're right, the pride that is present. And when he talks about a child, right, to change, to be kind of unconcerned with like the social status, advancing our own cause and taking this humility route. And he's saying that's the way that we have to change. And I love the way that he talks about this later in James. I want to look at this, James chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Jesus starts to kind of flesh out, okay, what would this change be like in the book of James? I want to look at this together. In the first verse, they ask the greatest question ever. He says, what causes the fights and quarrels among you? Very fair question, one that I ask all the time to my children. what is going on, right? To other people, what are you doing? Why are you fighting? What is the I will walk into a room. What is the problem? Like that's probably like my catchphrase at this point. It's like noise happening, escalating, and then I walk in. What's the problem, right? And I think James is getting right to the point here. What causes the fights and quarrels among you? And I love how we flesh it up because this is a question I think we ask. And if we're thinking about conflict, all right, what's causing it? Let's get to the root of this. What is the problem? James goes on to say in the very next thing, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have. So you kill. I was reading this in the version that I have here in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. I love what it says here. It says that you want something, but you don't get it. And man, when I think about conflict and I'm starting to think about humility, what often happens is that I have a desire inside of me for an outcome in a conflict. And most of the time we'll look at a conflict and we'll say, it's not me, right? It's not from inside me, it's them. If they would just, how many times have you said that? If you would just figure this out, if you would just learn that I'm always right, if you would just look at the evidence on this Facebook article that I sent you, if you would just look at this thing, right? If you would just see this from my perspective, right? We're often thinking about others and what we're thinking, it's them. They are the problem. We often will go far with that. And what James is saying is, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? This is, I think, essential. I'm going to skip over this one. When we think about going and looking at conflict, what we kind of have to admit is this. When we face conflict, it's because we want something. If we can get here and kind of say that, if we can step back and look at the conflict that we're thinking about and say, I want something, is usually the case. It's desires, right, that we have for an outcome of a situation. And those can start to take the lead. And this is where humility has to be present, because think about this. What if we went to an argument, if you were going to meet with this person that it always blows up, right, at a family gathering or dropping the kids off or whatever it is, or you're like, finally we're going to sit down and hash this out, and you walked in and said, hey, I just want you to know we're probably fighting because I'm not getting what I want. I don't know about you. First of all, I've probably never said that in my whole life. Never even thought about it, right? But what I start to realize is, I was thinking about this a lot this week. I'm like, if I actually sit down and think of a conflict that I'm having, every single time, I want something. Every single time. I was just thinking about this last night. Every single time, even ones that get resolved quickly. My son had a nice tantrum right before bedtime. It was great, super fun. Everyone's at their mental sharpness at that time of the day. And we get all the way to bed, we get through the tantrum. I'm like, I'm a great dad, I did this. And he goes, Dad, I'm hungry. And I'm like, you had dinner time, that magical time where we eat food. And my wife's like, let's just get the hamburger and bring it up to him. It's fine. And I was like, why am I upset about it? I'm like, because I want to relax, right? I'm like, son, it created this conflict in me. And I let him eat the hamburger in bed. It was awful. There were sesame seeds everywhere, but it was fine. But I'm thinking to myself, I wanted something. And I started to really think about this week. When I have a conflict, I always want something, right? When there's conflict, it's always something that I want. And so I think you and I, when we think about resolving conflict and starting to insert humility into this, we have to be willing to say, when there is conflict in my life, it's because I want something. I think that would be incredibly disarming and change the total tone of a conflict if we could say that to someone. Would you agree? I mean, it is like, there's no fighting after that, because they're going to be like, I've been trying to tell you you're wrong forever. I'm glad you finally realized, right? That's like the worst that could happen, right? It's disarming. It totally changes. It's very powerful, because what we're doing is we're owning our part in the conflict, whether it's a little or a lot. And I love that James goes immediately to talk about this, right? We see some more in this verse when we think about this, right? It talks about how that flushes out. And when we think about this desire, right, the thing is we're owning our part at this point. And what starts to happen is we realize that, because I'm sure you're saying, Aaron, my desire isn't wrong. Like it's not actually a bad one. And I hear you. Let's talk about that a little bit, because here's the thing, right? Even if the desire isn't wrong, probably most of us, if not all of us, this is one of those situations where I give you the chance to do it and then say, if not, you're probably lying. But when you think about conflict, right, we would look back and say, man, I would probably do that differently. I got a little angry at that. That was unexpected. And I responded in a way I wish I wouldn't have. When we look back on that, right, here's the thing. In a conflict, less wrong is still wrong. Okay, whether you're 10% wrong and they're 90% wrong, still wrong. So when we look at owning our part, right, owning the fact that we have a part in this conflict, whatever that is, if it's a little bit, a lot, wrong is still wrong, right? All of that. You might say, Aaron, but it's not fair. I'm like, I hear you. I don't know about you. I only bring up fairness when it benefits me, right? And I'm gonna be honest with you. Sometimes when I get the big helping of portion at Chipotle, I'm like, that's right, I deserve that. And when they're light on the chicken, I'm like, this isn't fair. I paid good money. I'm not offering them more money when they give me extra chicken, right? I only bring up fairness, right? Fairness, it's just, we kind of have to move that out, because we know, if we've lived life a little bit, life is generally not fair, right? I don't hear Jesus talking a lot about fairness. And also, it's usually only used to our advantage, right? We don't always share equally in the conflict. I get that, right? Sometimes there's significantly more wrong here than there is here. I get that. We may not always share equally in the conflict, but man, I think as believers who are saying, I want to do this the way that Jesus wants me to do this, if I actually want to engage conflict the way Jesus says to engage conflict, I actually have an equal responsibility, as far as it depends on me, to live at peace with everyone. Jesus doesn't say the person that's more wrong. He says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So equal responsibility in the conflict? Maybe not. Equal responsibility to live at peace? Definitely. Jesus helps us flesh all this out, and I love how this happens, because here's the thing, comparison is not going to get it done, right? We'll spend hours. I don't know about you, when I think about the conflicts in my life, I spend hours trying to think about it and comparing myself. I don't do that. Why do they do that? Why is it like, comparison is not going to get it done. Humility is going to get it done. And you might start to think, Aaron, but it's legitimate, right? It's legitimate desire that I have. And I want to dive into this a little bit more. I get that. Here's the thing about that, is when we start to think about desire, what happens is the right desire is not the problem, right? You might have a right desire. I just want my dad to be how a dad should be. I just want my sibling to be a sibling and love me the way they should. I just want this person to act like a friend. I just want my boss to be a kind person. Like, those are not wrong desires. I would look at you and say, you're not wrong for wanting that. But here's what starts to happen when we have a desire for something like that in conflict, and that's all we can think about. It starts to work its way deeper and deeper into my life and into my heart. And so the thing that I'm pursuing with most of my energy is that desire, right? I start demanding it from that person in the way I act towards them. I start to really, really get wrapped around the idea in my entire brain and heart that I deserve this, that I need this to be happy and to live life, right? And then I start to use it as excuses to maintain bitter feelings against people, to treat them poorly, or even to cut that relationship off completely. So the desire might be right, but it does not take us to the right place. And Jesus knows that, and it's why he encourages us to go to humility. We must be willing to say, I'm not getting what I want, and it feels bad. I get it, right? My desire for the relationship, what it should be, right? That's not wrong. Some of you are like, my desire for my kids' plans, if they would just realize that I have a good plan for their life, and they would just commit to that and sign this contract and realize that mom's always right? Man, my desire for what it would take me to forgive you, if you would just do these things, I would forgive you. Or if you look at them and say, if I did these things, why haven't they forgiven me, right? It starts to take us down this path of measuring and balance and all of these things. And I bet any conflict you're thinking about has that in it, right? It's a desire of ours to do this. And I love in James 3, because what do we do with that? I know that my desire is good, maybe. And I don't know what to do with that. When all the conflicts boil down to that, but what do I do with it? James goes on to say this. He says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses a friend to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell within us? But he gives us more grace. That is why Scripture said God opposes the proud but shows favor for the humble. I want to go back to the beginning of verse 3 there. When I think about humility, when I think about that, what James is saying here is when I ask for things, what am I actually asking God to do in this conflict? I was thinking about that a little this week. A lot of times I come in and I'm asking God, Lord, will you show them the error of their ways? How many of you have heard that or prayed? You don't have to raise your hand, we'd all be, but we've probably done it, right? Lord, show them that I'm right. Can't you just help them understand that they're right, that I'm right, and that they're wrong? Lord, my kids, you've put them in my care. Can't you just help their brains understand that I know what's best for them? That I understand this better than they do? God, would you just understand that they're wrong, and would you please punish them with bad luck in perpetuity? And would you also have a number of embarrassing things happen to them, such as intestinal distress at work, right? I don't know how far you go with that, but like when we ask, what are we asking for? I'm gonna have to give you a second with that, aren't I? That's my fault. But man, when I ask for things in conflict, generally I'm saying, Lord, help them, right? The Lord is asking us, he's saying that James says in the book there that we're asking we don't receive because we ask with wrong motives. And here's something that I realized this week. Man, when I go down this route and I have these desires, what actually is happening is that the things that I desire, right, that I'm almost demanding from people, is there a chance that what I should actually be doing is trusting God to meet the need of that desire instead of demanding it from someone else? Man, the thing that I desire, what if I never have a dad like I'm supposed to, that I want and that is good? Do I trust God to meet that need for me? Or am I just so scared about it that I'm demanding it from I think that's most of the time where I am in conflict. Right? When I worked the math backwards and said, I think that sometimes it comes down to I should be trusting God to meet the need of this desire, not trying to get it from another person. Whoa. To know that God actually wants to provide for me in that way. When I can humble myself and say, okay, I'm not getting what I want. And God, I trust you to meet that need for me. A lot of times we recognize that need and we want it and our desires take us there. But here's what has to happen, right? Our desires, they have to be searched so that the Lord can show us, hey, I can provide this for you. You can trust me for that, right? We have to be changed and start to reveal with it, right? And so as we deal with conflict, where this leaves you and I is that we have to be brave enough, bold enough to start examining our own hearts before we're going to walk down this road of resolving conflict. It is probably the least comfortable thing to do. It is not super fun. Yeah, I would even say it's awful sometimes. But if I'm going to trust God fully, surrender my desires to him, right? If I'm going to do that, I have to be bold enough and brave enough to ask God, will you search my heart? God, here's the desires I have. I think they're right. Will you help me make sense of these? I think God will show us some tough things. I think God will change us, right? I think all of that will happen. And here's what happens, right, is humility, when we can exercise this, it's going to help us see what is most important in resolving conflict. And it's probably not going to be getting my desired outcome most of the time. Sometimes maybe. But I think we have to kind of surrender and reserve ourselves to the fact that that might not happen. So as far as it depends on me, I'm going to prepare my heart and myself and my mind for this. And man, if total resolution happens, praise God. But am I ready for the fact that if it doesn't, where does that leave me, right? Am I going to trust God to provide for that desire? Maybe I should have been going to him for that all along, right? We start to think about this. And remember, all right, this humility part is not the end. It's the starting point, right? So it's not like I have to just go in and say I'm wrong and then it's over. Not saying that, right? I just want you to imagine this. Imagine if two humble people came into the room to resolve a conflict. I don't think you're leaving there with any other answer except for peace with each other. You may not even have relationship, but I'm pretty sure if two people can do this, I think it's going to be very different. It's going to be very hard to not leave with peace as far as it depends on you. So when we think about this, right, we have to be willing to start with saying, I am not getting what I want. I contemplated having everyone say that together, like a nice little group where we could just be like, all right, after me, repeat after me. I'm not going to do that. But you might want to say that this week, right? To think, God, I'm not getting what I want. Maybe I don't even know what that is yet, but I know that that's probably why there's conflict. To start to think about it that way, right? When we think about humility, what we're actually doing is we are surrendering our desires to the Lord. So this week you might want to think about, Lord, I'm just going to surrender my desires to you, the good ones, the right ones, the ones that God would say, you're not wrong for wanting that. But Lord, I want you to have your way with these. Not Aaron to have his way with these, not, right, whoever, right? Lord, what you want to do with these desires, however you want to meet the need of that desire, I'm in for that. And so I think really what we're doing, right, is we're surrendering those desires to God. And what humility becomes is not necessarily, it's not weakness, right? It's not like giving in to a person. Right, when we talk about humility and conflict, it is what you're actually doing, what you and I are doing is a heart of humility is one that says, I am in agreement with God. If I want to look and say, I want to do this Jesus' way, right? I want to look at the Bible and see what it says about conflict and about hearts. If I want to do it that way, humility is actually saying, I'm in agreement with God all the way through. Over the next couple weeks when we finish out this series, I am in agreement with God. If you can set your hearts there, if I can do that, if you can do that, I believe there's not much conflict that can't be resolved, at least as far as it depends on us. So as we finish out here, we're going to give you some time to think about this, but I want to give you a couple specific things to think about this week. The first one is this, is ask God to search our hearts and desires. As you pray this week, as you maybe think about the conflict, right? I've asked you to think about yourself a lot more than anything else this week, but ask God to search your heart's desires this week, my heart's desires this week, to think, God, what is it that I actually want? If I'm not aware of that, maybe it did not take me long to realize that as I thought about this week. I'm like, every single conflict I can think of, I wanted something. So ask God to search that and say, is it right? Am I trusting God for this, or am I trying to get it myself? What am I doing here? The second thing is this, is own my part, right? When you think, whatever conflict it is that you're thinking of, maybe it's multiple, I don't know, start to ask the Lord, how can I own the fact that I have significant part in this conflict, right? That I've played a role in this. It's not me against them. It's like we are in this together. And Lord, will you help me own my part? Help me own my part this week. And the last thing is this, is try to get our hearts to a place where we can ask God to help us rely on him as you work through this conflict. We're talking about as far as it depends on us. So as far as we can tell, this is what Jesus says to do with our hearts. The only thing you and I can control in these situations is ourselves. So I don't know what the end result of that conflict is going to be, but if you can rely on God to say, these are my desires, it's something that I want, God, will you help me rely on you for whatever the outcome is? Maybe I'm at peace on my part, but God, I'm struggling with the loss of what this relationship should be. I'm really struggling with the way you designed this relationship to work this way, and it's absent from my life. To ask God to help you rely on him to provide for those areas that kind of feel like holes in our hearts, things that are missing, right? And it's not fair. It's not right. But God, how do you want to provide for me in that area? Man, when we think about this work, it's so good because what God is doing, if we are followers of Jesus, is he's refining our hearts and helping us realize that our identity is not in what we get out of life. It's not what we get out of the conflicts or how well we do them. It's not by comparison, but in a desire to be in agreement with God that he is going to provide for us, right? That's how he's going to start to refine it, is that God is the one who sets out my identity, who I am, right? Who he's created to be, where he wants me to go, right? And he's going to do that. And guys, I want to say this lastly, is I realize there may be another group of people in this room, and we're talking mostly about pride on the humility side, right? That sometimes it's hard to admit our part in it. I realize there are some conflicts where you may be in a situation where all you can see is the wrong that you've done, and you may be plagued by that, right? Shame, you may kind of be devolved into shame about the way you've handled a conflict. It's a real place to be. And you might be struggling with that. And here's the really cool thing about this is when we talk about humility and being in agreement with God, if that's where you are in conflict and you're like, yeah, Aaron, all I can see is my part in this, I want you to know that humility plays the same role for you. You're well aware of your part in the conflict, but humility in that situation is knowing that the Lord offers forgiveness to you. That's what's so cool. From pride, we need humility. And from feeling the lowest of low in our lives, we need the humility to say that God wants to do something with me. He wants to forgive me, right? That actually the grace and mercy that he exercised in my name on the cross is available to me. And so the first step for you might know your part very well, but be struggling to accept God's gift of grace and forgiveness in the situation. And that might be where your humility comes in. It takes an enormous amount of humility to say to God that I am wrong and I need you to be Lord of my life because here I am. And to know and understand that you are forgiven. Not to just kind of believe that, but to know that you are forgiven. I realize that you might be there. And so I want you to know that humility and this process works too. But it comes from a place of saying, maybe I just need to accept the forgiveness that God has given me. Because sometimes it feels like we're just so far away. God can't possibly forgive. And I want you to know the Lord is going to meet you right where you are. And he's going to walk you through this too. And it's going to be the same. It's going to be hard. But it starts here with humility to say to the Lord, I'm going to accept your forgiveness and mercy. And I'm going to be in agreement with you on that too. And it does the same thing for us. It's incredible to me as I thought this week that the Lord brings us out of both of these places with humility. And I really believe after this week looking at this, I was convicted in ways that I'm like, man, I always want something, man. Isn't that the worst feeling? But to know that the Lord is patient, he's kind, right? And he walks with us through this. And if we ask him to do this, I would say buckle up, because I think you're going to have a lot of wins in conflict, however they pan out, but knowing that you are in standing with the Lord where you're doing what he asked, to know that if there's a need that I wanted from this conflict that I'm never going to get, the Lord will provide for me in that way. So as you do this week, as you think about it, let me pray. We'll give you some time to I encourage you to ask these questions to the Lord in prayer, to maybe think about specific situations where you might have to kind of maybe write some of this down, whatever works for you, but to ask these questions of God in your own heart this week. Pray with me. Lord, we're so thankful for your grace and mercy for us, first of all. We know that, God, in conflict, very few of us ever move through that at a good pace, at one that is flawless. And so, God, we recognize first that we need you. God, humility is probably one of the hardest things for us to do. But God, it's also the most necessary, either for us to begin a relationship with you and the continued thought of humility as we move through tough relationships and conflict in our lives. God, you know where each of our individual hearts are with this, where we might struggle, where we might be very aware of the specific pride that we have. God, help us to be able to look at our hearts and at you and say, God, I'm not getting what I want. And I want to trust you with that. And I want you to move in conflict through this and help us to think about moving into conflict with a game changer, something that is more powerful than any strategy, God, but with humility to say that we have a part in this. God, as we do this work, just be with us because it really sets the tone for how you are going to move and work through us. So help us to do this hard work of exercising humility in our relationships and in our hearts, to put ourselves in the position, Lord, where you can work supernaturally in the conflicts that we face. We love you, Jesus. We're thankful for this work. Amen.